All right, why don't we get started because we have a lot to cover and we have an amazing panel here today. Welcome everyone to our fourth seminar on the fourth wave of open data. I'm Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, and I'm delighted to be the host today. And today we will focus on data commons for the public good. Before I introduce the panel, let me briefly set the stage on why we are here and what's the context of the seminar series that we are currently holding as well. Next slide, please. Now, at GovLab, we've been, and especially at the Open Data Policy Lab, over the years, we've been monitoring the evolution of open data. And a few years ago, we identified kind of three waves that open data has evolved with. The first wave was really about freedom of information, where information could be requested and hopefully shared. The second wave, where we actually had data being pushed forward, was kind of the open government data wave. And then the last wave, the third wave that we identified, was kind of about not only accessing to private sector, but also accessing not only accessing public sector, but also accessing private sector data through data collaboratives, which is kind of a broad term for a variety of data exchange platforms or governance arrangements as well. Next slide. Now, each wave had a distinctive kind of characteristic, and it's important to say is that each wave built upon the previous wave, and that we are still, of course, today experiencing those three waves. First wave, as I said, was really about data on request. Second wave, there was the movement towards making data open by default. And then the third wave was really about publishing with a particular kind of purpose as well. Next slide. Now, what we have witnessed, of course, is the arrival of Gen AI. And what we see is that those three waves are still existing, but that we might also enter a fourth wave in a variety of ways. On the one hand, open data can be used to improve AI, both in terms of quality of AI output, but also open data can be used in ways that can support public interest use cases, especially as it relates to kind of RAG use cases where data is being used to augment existing foundational models. But what we see as well is that Gen AI itself can actually be used to democratize open data as well, both in terms of providing more conversational interfaces with the data so that you don't always need to have a background in data science in order to make sense of data that is being shared. But it also can, anyway, accelerate, for instance, the generation of code books, but it can also help us improve the quality of data or even fill in data gaps where data gaps might exist as well. And so that's what we have labeled the fourth wave of open data, right? That actually builds upon the previous waves, but that we are seeing that Gen AI is actually giving, on the one hand, a new wave, a new kind of opportunity to leverage data in ways that we didn't anticipate beforehand as well. Next slide. And that's what we are trying to do in this seminar series, is to actually unpack, because we still have a question mark at the end. Are we actually really entering a fourth wave, and what holds us back? And it suffices to say is that there is no one way to think about the fourth wave. There are multiple scenarios where open data can be used for, of course, public interest AI, but also, as we will talk about today, can actually open data be the foundation, or at least a version of that, for instance, open source AI as well, which is another big discussion that we are currently having as well. Next slide. We also have collected, for those who are interested, a whole range of examples, because typically at GovLab, we not only want to put out a concept, we actually also want to understand how it is evolving. And for those who are interested in actually really getting insight of kind of real use cases as it relates to the intersection between Gen AI and open data, I highly recommend going to our repository. And for those who have been part of previous seminars, we of course have invited many of those examples on the previous panels as well, to get really a better understanding on what works and what does not work as well. Next slide. And so from our point of view, if we talk about the fourth wave of open data, we're really talking about kind of four distinctive issues. One is really about can we really use open data platforms, or do we need to really go into more of kind of a data commons approach? And this is, of course, the topic that we will talk about today, mainly because there's also concern that open data and open commons to a large extent might have led to some kind of extractive behavior in how Gen AI has leveraged those existing commons. And the question is, do we need a new kind of way to provide access to data that is aligned with the commons kind of approach as well? And of course, as I mentioned, Gen AI can also be used for making data conversational, can be used for improving data quality. And of course, data quality and provenance has become more important than ever before. And of course, the key question that we also addressed at a certain point in time during another seminar is what will it take to make actually open data AI ready? Because not all data is actually AI ready as well. But today, we're going to focus, next slide, on the data commons. These are the four kind of seminars that we already, or that we are having. We already addressed some of the barriers and pathways. We addressed the data quality. We also addressed kind of conversational AI, and today we are specifically focusing on data commons and what we mean by that and what is the potential of that as well. Next slide. Now, at GovLab, of course, we also been working on that, and we have gone public, basically arguing that data commons is kind of the missing infrastructure for public interest AI. And perhaps Alek can reflect on that as well, whether that's true or what we mean by that. Next slide. And we also have tried to identify some kind of data commons examples that show the way on how access to data can be used for AI as well, whether it's anyway the Lacuna Fund or it's the Mozilla Voice kind of examples. And of course, one of our partners is also the Institutional Data Initiative at Harvard Law School, because key element here, which I also forgot to mention, is that when we talk about open data at times of Gen AI, we're talking about data that goes beyond tabular data, because that's another big element of the fourth wave of open data, is that Gen AI is actually mainly interested in kind of language models. And so that quite often means unstructured data. It quite often means non-tabular data. And the open data community is still very much focused on kind of tabular data. And so that's where data commons comes also into place, where you can actually have access to more unstructured data, ways to actually then generate some insights from that for Gen AI purposes. Next slide. We also, anyway, try to help the creation of those data commons. So we developed a blueprint. Next slide. I'm not going to go because today is not the focus on what we are doing at GovLab, but it suffices to say is that today is also a big day for us at GovLab, because today is also the deadline for anyone who wants to submit a proposal to our new Commons Challenge, because what we hope to do is not just have conversations about it, but also actually really spur innovation and experimentation. And so we're delighted that we have been able to partner with Microsoft, but also with Direct Relief, with Crisis Ready, and with Harvard Law Library, together also with UNESCO as our kind of international observer, to launch this kind of challenge. And the main purpose of the challenge is to exactly spur the creation of data commons, but also to actually understand what is the demand, right? Is there actually a demand for data commons? And what are some of the use cases that we, if we don't create data commons, that we actually would ignore as well? So that's enough. Next slide. Enough for me in setting the stage. As I said, those are the topics that we will hope to discuss today. And we have four amazing panelists here joining us for the hour. We have Angie Raymond, who is a professor of business law and ethics and the director of data management and information governance at the Ostrom Workshop. By the way, we thought it would be super important to have someone from the Ostrom Workshop, because everyone, when we talk about commons, of course, Eleanor Ostrom is quoted on a regular basis. So it would be really interesting, how does it actually relate with Eleanor Ostrom's work and with the Ostrom Workshop. And so that's why we are also super excited to also have Heather Coates joining today, who focuses on digital scholarship and is the data management librarian at the Indiana University, but also affiliated, of course, with the Ostrom Workshop. Then we have dVivienne Ming, who is the chief scientist of a data commons called the Human Trust. So we wanted to make sure that we had someone who actually has experience with running a data commons and what it means and how you go about this. And we have Alek Tarkowski, who's director of strategy of Open Future and has written extensively on, for instance, data commons, but also open source AI, and then more recently, public AI as well. So thanks everyone for joining. So let's dive straight in and start with dVivienne. And so thanks again, because you've been on seminars before, so we're always delighted that you're willing to come back. And so eager to hear from you, dVivienne. Tell us a little bit about the Human Trust and why did you decide to create it? And also, how does this fit within the current environment of Gen AI, right? Because obviously, we are also focusing on how can data be used for actually public interest Gen AI use cases, and is kind of what you have worked on, kind of a trust-like, data commons-like model, the way forward to actually do this. Over to you, dVivienne.
Terrific. Thank you for having me. And I will try to keep this a little bit shorter than my usual 3-hour answers. I mean, there is what the Human Trust is today. There is kind of where it started, where I got my inspiration. And I'll say, even today, it's still very much a learning experience. So things evolve. I learn on these seminars, what others are engaged in. But my introduction to this comes from my background in neuroscience, back in my academic days at Carnegie Mellon and UC Berkeley. I remember senior neuroscientists commenting on what at the time was a very nascent movement to opening up neuroscience data and letting everyone be able to do this work, particularly groups like mine, which were theoretical computational neuroscientists. So we lived on open data. And this one senior neurophysiologist said, I am happy to share my data once I have squeezed every possible publication out of it that I possibly can. Then you can have my data. And obviously, that's a dead end for what we're talking about here today. But I think that's still a really dominant perspective of many people. There's a lot of self-interest here, a lot of careers built on this. When I became an entrepreneur, I encountered the same thing up to this day, especially in a world of AI companies bringing in lots of money. You may or may not be shocked how many of these companies are built off of a sole value proposition of having a unique data set. In other words, their data moat becomes their only real unique IP, which then comes to another motivation of mine, which is research I do in collective intelligence and trying to understand what makes communities smart. Well, I mean, somewhat obviously, it doesn't take an expert to realize if only one group has access to the data, you can't possibly be producing the best science, the best products, the best impact on the world. But, it doesn't take a huge commitment to the idea of an open market to realize one small group isn't going to do that. And then the last ingredient for me is a civil rights ingredient. For more than a decade, I have run a philanthropic lab. We had this proposition that we would simply help people for free. You bring us a problem, and if we could offer a unique insight on the problem, then we'd pay for everything and give away whatever we invented. And it was shocking how often groups turned us down because they just didn't believe we were going to do it for free, no matter what our history was. And the idea of somehow putting our money where our mouth is, putting in the legal structures that would prevent us from abusing the data was part of it as well. And once I started working on that, just realizing I don't have to think of OpenAI or Google or any of these organizations as bad actors to appreciate that what's in their interest is not always going to be in mine. So that all these different motivations behind what eventually became the Human Trust, really an evolution of my philanthropic lab. And today, quite appropriate to a lot of your lead in here and also the next session you're going to run. Today, our ambition is to build a foundation model, a large scale transformer model trained on human development data. And so not just behavioral data, not just textual data, epigenetic data, biomedical data, sampled densely over time. So that's our current big focus. Instead of predicting the next word in a sentence, predict the next beat in a lifetime. And obviously the goal here is to shift those predictions from why don't, instead of staying home on Thursday, why don't you take a walk? But with the ambition being, and this ties into some specific projects we're running right now, many people might be shocked how much of long-term health outcomes are associated with social determinants or behavioral determinants of health. So being able to say, take a walk today, could genuinely shift your risk for a project we're working on is breast cancer, another is postpartum depression, another is ischemic heart disease, another is Alzheimer's, shift these. But again, the point is, why would anyone share data with us? How do we collectivize this data that may be held in many different labs? It may be held by nonprofits and for-profits. So unlike, I think, where some of our conversations, Stefan, in the past had started around things like open data around geolocating information and this sort of public good data, here we're looking at profoundly personal data that is clearly both education data, medical data, legal and civil rights data that people would be very reasonable to not want to share, but also it's data that is unambiguously identifiable. It's unrealistic that you could de-identify it. And I'm a machine learning person. I don't want to de-identify it. I want to be able, these are my training samples. Knowing who someone is actually crucially important. So these are all the ingredients to go into what we do. And again, I think I got it in somewhere around an hour for my answer. But this is our ambition with experiments with federated data, experiments with holding data internally in a sandbox and it never leaves. We're trying all sorts of different ideas to build that core data set of, we're calling it a biobehavioral foundation model. So we can train this up and make these forward predictions of life outcomes and then make targeted recommendations. We like the perverse and oxymoronic concept of precision public health, making simple everyday recommendations that are actually grounded in long-term, genuine, specific health recommendations. So this is our ambition behind what we're doing. And as I say, we're pretty promiscuous in trying to experiment with different methodologies of protecting that data and sharing it in different ways. We want groups to be able to come in, touch the entire data set, all with the explicit permission of the people, the individuals contributing the data, touch the entire data set, generate new data, and add value back in. They get to build whatever they want to build, including for-profit organizations, but they don't get to own the data. Build the best product, produce the best papers, and let's stop debating over who owns the data and just hoarding it and not sharing it. So this is the whole aspiration. It's insanely big, but why do anything else?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Vivienne, for the update, and also to really, I mean, also address the kind of the incentives problem, because anyway, we actually before this call, I mean, we do a lot of work with the Wellcome Trust at the moment around accessing social data as well, but also anyway, how do we have access to a kind of unstructured data that would be beneficial if you could find a way to linkage, and the incentive question always comes up for sure. So from your perspective, Vivienne, so what are the incentives within a data commons for people to collaborate? And then I will go to Angie to touch more on and Heather to touch more on the governance questions here as well. But so
Yeah.
have you figured out what our kind of driver is? It R&D? And yeah, and I always forget this is of course an open seminar. So if you have questions, feel free to add those questions in the Q&A, and ideally identify who you want the question to be answered. That would be helpful as well. And I will look and monitor it on a regular basis. Over to you, Vivienne.
So one of the incentives we want to look at is the sort of user citizen incentive themselves. If we want people to actively participate in, then we need them to get something back. And so part of what we look at, for example, is building models that, we don't want to get trapped. This is a separate issue, but we don't want to get caught up in whether we're making explicit health recommendations and have to go through FDA approval. If we can keep it in the realm of wellness recommendations,
Yeah.
even though our models are explicitly tying them to health, then obviously we can provide that back. So the vision here is individuals can come in, share their data, whatever they want to. They want to share smartwatch data, that's great. If they're willing, so we've built a series of, calling it a chatbot is underselling. There's a lot of AI behind the scenes, but bots that will chat with people and walk them through scenarios. The goal isn't so much that the chatbot itself is an intervention. It's really just itself generating more data. And so we actually try to make certain the bot isn't, because, for example, we could have people in crisis. Boy, the last thing we want is someone in a suicidal crisis moment talking to an unregulated chatbot without a human being on the line. So we're taking all of that off the table, and we're really looking at how people contributing the data with the full understanding that others will be able to make use of it without being able to see their personal identity, that they're getting back education recommendations, wellness/health recommendations, and others, workforce type recommendations. So that's the incentives on one side, because we want high quality, continuous data collected on a sort of microgenetic basis. On the other side, I think what you're really getting at is the opportunity for groups to come in and on day one have a large number of potential users and their data available for running a study, not just a data study, running an ongoing study. So the three of the projects we're running right now are essentially using the live set of individuals inside the human trust, deploy within our platform an ongoing study where you are able to track people, run textual based experiments, control studies, as well as collaborating with groups that can actually do things like epigenetic data collection or blood serum, hormone level collection. So it's an opportunity for groups to come in and essentially inherit a large set of data, whether for scientific purposes, whether for product development. Our board has to approve any of these outside groups coming in and interacting. They don't get to interact directly with the data. They interact with a sandbox inside a sandbox, and then we deploy it throughout the system. But it creates this opportunity for essentially relatively small labs or entrepreneurial endeavors or nonprofits to come in and directly interact with large data sets that they never otherwise get an opportunity to. And I'll say, not that I've ever thought of it this way, but having gone from being an academic to, an entrepreneur, a multi-time chief scientist with data sets of 100 million people, like what you can do with a data set like that is astonishing. And it's, I think, very challenging for a lot of small scale researchers in different organizational structures to gain access to data sets like that. And certainly to gain access to live data sets that are evolving, have actual people interacting with them, making that available at scale is kind of a genuine, unique incentive unto itself.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Vivienne. And it was great to start with Vivienne to really set the opportunity space here, right? If we get this right, because I think too often we anyway start with some kind of the risks, but anyway, we also need to start thinking about what is it that we could do if we figure out a new way, which Vivienne has been working on, new way of actually providing access to data in ways that anyway aligns with kind of people's expectations and preferences, and also have a return and shared benefit model as well. So let's go, Angie and Heather, to both of you. And again, I realize you probably have both a lot to add separately as well. But tell us a little bit about, anyway, when we, as I said, when the term commons gets dropped, then of course, Eleanor Ostrom gets also quickly associated. And you're both from the Ostrom Workshop. So tell us a little bit about, anyway, what's the connection here from your perspective?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, first of all. And so I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on this because the audience is usually full of two types of people. You already know this or you don't, and there's not enough time to solve either of those problems, right? So what I want to do is direct you to something that we undertook in the early 20s. We were getting a lot of questions exactly like what's coming up today. We have this data set. What do we do with it? How might we use it better? And by the way, it's probably only going to be better, whatever that means, if we can bring the data together with others. And so we saw everything from questions about smart cities, which is a train wreck unto itself at the time, to GPS sharing, to medical stuff. And that was actually where a lot of what we started this conversation with actually occurred in, because it seemed to me during those initial sessions that this shouldn't be such a big problem. If doctors and medical researchers want to share data for the good of mankind, what's the holdup? And I was shocked. And so what Vivienne's talking about caused us to bring a group together that was actually sponsored by Mozilla. And we started asking how the Ostrom design framework might work. And so we started here with, and I promise not to read this out loud to you, but what you'll see is, we defined in new terminology the basic 8 design principles that Eleanor Ostrom put forward. And the biggest one, and the one I do want to push back on a little bit, is, the use of the terms commons doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means. It's not just a group of you standing in a room together, because it's great and we're really happy. But there is this idea of you have to have this clearly defined boundary around the resource itself, whatever that means. And so then, of course, we do the design principles for those of you who are familiar with Ostrom. What are the rules in play? How are those rules made? How do we monitor as a collective those rules and the sanctions, which is a fancy word really for enforcement? How do we resolve conflicts? How do we ensure individuals have the right to self-governance, which is one of the biggest barriers, quite honestly, at times for a lot of this stuff. And then something that's a little more difficult to talk about, and that's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is this nestedness or the interoperability, which the Ostroms actually spent a bunch of time on. And as we began to work with groups, we realized what we really needed was to put out in an open space a list of questions that people need to be thinking about. And that's what we did. So this is, how do you evaluate a data commons? These were, sort of the metrics that we decided to use. Our original intention was to go around and grade some of these as they came up and sort of say, hey, you're a 3. We think you could be a 5 if you did this and that. These took off very quickly, which I'm very happy with. So we were sort of riding at the wave when this began. But then we started talking about design questions. And this is really where most of the team that I work with is really interested in, is to think about what are the key questions to help the different entities, individuals, institutions come together and begin to ask the difficult questions that will allow them to create a data commons. Now, this is widely available. It's open. Everything we do open, as people were talking about, right? Which again leads to some hesitation in so many ways. But I genuinely mean it. I think we need to have these questions and these frameworks and have conversations about this so individuals can begin to use these. The next set of questions, though, that came up, and these are also available, but apologies, I didn't save the link, is actually, what form these needed to take or what structure. And so I want to point out what dVivienne has done as something that isn't necessarily a commons, right? You heard her use the word trust. And so we struggled at first with this idea of cooperative, nonprofit. So there's also a great toolbook, pathway, toolbook, however you want, of questions of which of these would work best for you. So if you have a bunch of data and it's open data that you could almost find anywhere, Commons is probably perfectly fine. Let everyone have it. When you're talking about medical data and stuff like that, at least in the United States, I firmly support the idea of a trust because lawyers will tell you that creates a fiduciary responsibility as it relates to that data. And that puts that extra, little bit of oomph in the way that we deal with the data, especially this highly sensitive data. So there are these different, a different playbook, I guess, that we have out that allows you to think through, wait, should we be a business entity? Should we be an LLC? And there are situations where that's the case. Should it be a trust? And truly set it up in the American way that we use the term trust. Not part of the problem, because I originally started talking about trusts, was it turns out the whole world doesn't have that legal function everywhere. And so how do we navigate that then? If we're talking about a medical trust, but now we're stepping outside into a legal regime that doesn't actually recognize the fiduciary duties as it was with a trust. So that was the most recent playbook we did. And so that will sort of give you some structure, but that is exactly how Ostrom ties into this. We used her 8 design principles to start shifting some of the original questions. And just to be 100% clear, we build very much off some of the work that Ada Lovelace has done as well. So, and Stefan, I mean, there's a group of us that have been building on each other's work, and I would feel really bad if at the time our original work had some of the Ada Lovelace people involved in it as well while we were doing this. And then we decided to go very specific into sticking with some of the Ostrom model, and Ada Lovelace actually adds some stuff to it, which I think is equally valuable. It's just a little bit different. Heather, do you want to share a little bit about how this is playing out at IU? Because it sounds like we share some stuff with dVivienne as well.
Yeah, so one of the roles I have is as the data steward for research data at the IU system. And I see a lot of data agreements, which exposes us to a whole other set of issues with respect to data governance. But I think one of the things I've been thinking about as we've had conversations within the Indiana University Research Data Commons, or the RDC, which is an approximately 2-year-old initiative where we're trying to improve support for both data sharing out that is produced at IU, but also make it easier for people to get access to data that's licensed at IU. And this is initiated by Coastal Lee Simon, and it's funded by the VPR now, Vice President for Research. But the work that we've done in that space, and then within sort of the data governance space, I think I'm going to take a couple of steps back and share my perspective about, I think, where I hope we're going next. So, and dVivienne spoke to this, and I'm so glad. One of the issues that I have with generative AI, and I don't love that terminology, but whatever, with the modern AI tools, is that they are disembodied. We are embodied creatures. These, for the most part, we are looking at technologies that are built on words and somewhat computer vision. So we know this in academia and industry, but consumers of these products don't necessarily recognize that the reduction in data collection, that the reduction in creating tools based on this very narrow set of data about our world and the human experience limits and puts boundaries around what it can actually do. And we're not having that conversation with consumers of the products. So we have these consumer products that are built on data that people didn't really have a say in, their data being included and the training, et cetera. So going forward, And that you talk about this in the Reimagining Data Governance for AI. We have to take a participatory community-based approach. And it's not just that the community gets a say, but I think it's that the community needs to be a co-creator. So it's not enough for researchers to say, we have the study, or we see that you have this data, we have a really interesting problem we want to solve, but we need to take that community-based approach and go to the communities and ask, what problems do you have? Is it that you want to build an urban garden, but you're not sure what is the best way to use the space that you have to produce the best yield, minimize pests? We have technology that's used sort of locally. They've used drones to take images of tree cover to identify ash trees affected by ash borers to help with environmental conservation efforts. Could we use that to solve community problems if we take the technology to the community, or the opportunity to the community, rather than saying, we're going to collect this data on you because we have these questions, we'll give it back to you, but does it actually help them in any way? Does it actually speak to the needs that they have? So I think we need to start with the co-creation piece when we start to talk about data governance. But the second piece of this, and you all probably know this better than I do, institutions of higher ed, businesses, we are not set up to contract with individuals. So we need communities to be legal entities in some way, shape, or form, which means that there needs to be a lot of the Ostrom conditions in place. There need to be boundaries. They need to be recognized in some way so that we can treat them as partners and not just participants. Or sources of data. So I think we're starting to work through some of these issues around community-oriented projects. So for example, if you bring a historical object in and you want to understand the history of that or the origin of that better, is that a place where we could begin to use AI as well as data creation methods that the institution is partnering with communities alongside? And maybe library consortia are a place to do this. Maybe we need to create other kinds of legal entities. But how do we begin to work with the community and not study them, which is this we have a history of a very extractive data collection and biomedical research for decades. Johns Hopkins and the Baltimore community has it. Indianapolis has it with the School of Medicine. So I think that's where I would like to see us go as an institution, in addition to figuring out how do we actually function in a way that does not drown our contracting folks in these one-off agreements. Like, how do we do this in a sustainable way that does not require the institution to commit to hiring 3 more research contract experts, right? Like, that is the level of nitty-gritty rub that I think about when I do this work on a weekly basis. So I'm going to stop there. Angie, what did I miss? Thoughts?
If I might jump in, I actually, it's interesting everything you say. Having started many companies and done philanthropic work for many years, building the trust, like the default mode of both our engineers and our lawyers is throw the standard boilerplate stuff up on the website. Well, no. If our sole fiduciary responsibility is to the humans and bodies from whom our data is coming, then we can't reserve the right to change our terms and conditions at any time. We can't do all of this standard stuff. It turns out it would be so much easier building an organization whose intention was to exploit people's data than to build an organization specifically geared the opposite. And further perversely, it's even more difficult in Europe than it is here, again, for the very reason that they've set up laws intending to protect people's data. Well, it turns out they were built assuming you weren't aligned with the users. The last thing I'll say is, absolutely, it was an explicit intention to build it as a trust, but it isn't just the fiduciary responsibility, although that's crucial. It again is because, as I mentioned, so many groups with whom we don't have a fiduciary responsibility in our structure would not engage because they were suspicious. And just taking data ownership off the table as a legal consideration just made it so much more clear to our collaborators, not just, you know, the fiduciary beneficiaries, but the third-party collaborators, that we're not here to do anything except solve the problem. And that's the last one that really resonated with your comments, Heather. I get asked to give lots of talks about AI for good. And for me, it's like hammers for good. You know, don't hit people with hammers, build things. I don't mean to trivialize it, but we can get caught up in building these frameworks or these philosophical commitments. And I will say the starting point for doing good with AI is problem solving. And problem solving means owning the whole problem and making certain you're solving something real, not just an engineering problem. And so that really resonates what you said, Heather, that way too often, and I see this in a long history, way too often people are going in thinking, I'm going to save the world, companies, nonprofits as well, but they never truly understand the problem they're solving. And they just think, but I did the AI for good steps that I'm supposed to do, therefore we're doing good. And you got to own the whole thing and really understand the problem space, which I get it makes more trouble for the lawyers. But if it were so easy that you could just replicate the exact same structure every time, then we wouldn't still be having these discussions.
Great. Well, very rich. And again, I have like 100 follow-up questions, but Alek has been very patient and probably has also 100 ways to respond to what he heard so far. And in the meantime, we have several questions as well. So if I can ask Vivienne, Angie, and Heather, if you're see one of the questions and you can answer it kind of through the answer option, that might be a way to do it as well, because I'm afraid we might run out of time very quickly. But Alek, over to you. I mean, one question would be, what have you heard that resonates with your thinking? But more importantly, Alek, of course, you've done a lot of work also on data commons as kind of a vehicle for public AI, for especially open source AI. And so over to you, Alek.
Okay. Well, although I kind of feel, and I really like Vivienne, what you just said, but it felt like at the end it should be you, Stefan, who should step in, because basically I heard you, Vivienne, talking about stewardship, which is something you, Stefan, has been talking for a long time, and I sort of learned about this theme and learned to appreciate it from you. But that would be where I would start, because that's what we exactly need. I think if this approach is to succeed, it needs to move from being some kind of a formula, right? Like a formulaic approach that will tick off, to a sort of living approach, right? That is just the principles are, a team building a data set and managing and stewarding just believes in them, but then brings them to life. Because just as a quick background, and I'll try to be brief, at Open Future, we've been working similarly like Angie's team on these sets of principles. And I think we've all done a fair share, and also other projects in figuring this out. I try to think of it as a sort of, let's say, as something that builds on top of the really successful deployment of open data. I want to be clear, I don't think data commons are meant to replace open data. I really like, again, the formulation of waves is very good here. But I've been writing quite a lot to the effect, trying to say that basically open data today will not be enough, I think, in many cases. I think there are cases where it is enough, but simply in many situations, and this has been highlighted in this seminar, I don't think it's just enough to add a license. And maybe that's for me currently the most interesting thing, that this is, I think there is a way of thinking of open data and data commons open data for things like, I don't know, geodata, simple little privacy issues. And then you get to sensitive data, let's say health data, well, you bring in the data commons and it's something very complex. But I think, by the way, data commons means a lot of things. And I think it's also gradual improvements basically on the open data setup, but taking care of things like, for instance, gated access. There's quite a lot of interesting, I think, cases happening now on Hugging Face, where ultimately the data is shared as an open data set. You can do a lot with it, but there's this really simple step, and it doesn't require a lot of fancy setups or legal analysis, where basically they just track who's using the data set. And I would say that's a shift towards data commons that I think is very important. And maybe I think the challenge with talking about data commons, this is my challenge now in the limited time, that I think it's a much more complex model than open data. And Angie, you did a good job by saying if you follow all these principles, there's really a lot. When we did our mapping, there were issues related to participation, which Heather already covered. There were issues that turned out for us that labor issues, which are raised by quite a lot of interesting groups in relation to generative AI, right? Both unpaid volunteer labor that we're all doing around data, conditions of paid labor on data. This can be framed as a data commons issue, right? Then there are concerns around transparency, which basically means what goes into the training data set, which again, probably open data solves it, but there are many cases where we don't have open data and we'd still like to see transparency in data training. We think it's a theme that fits into data commons. The one theme that hasn't been raised, and maybe I'll mention it here, is the issue of protecting the commons. And I think this is something that's sort of novel that the data commons framework brings to the conversation of using data. Open data was sort of the model was it's going to be fine. Reuse is just going to be added value, right? I think with current debate, especially on use of data for generative AI, a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders bring in concerns. And I think here data commons can bring a framework where you're thinking about how to protect the data. And I think the most interesting questions are around protecting something that people sometimes call collective data rights, which also I know, by the way, Stefan, you've been working on it. And I think this is a very important issue to explore. Basically, the key issue, and I know we've been talking here, dVivienne, your examples are a lot about health data, but I would like to put on the table also the issue of linguistic data, which is key for AI training, for generative AI models, for so-called, you can call them frontier or general purpose models. I'm unsure whether I froze or it looks like I did freeze.
You're frozen, but we can hear you. But
Okay, it is
so we have a
very
wonderful
strange.
picture of your last
Yes, I
your
tried to
last
fix work.
unfrozen moment.
I'm sorry, I managed to make it completely black. That's not great. So maybe this is the cue that I should wrap up and move to the Q&A. But so the last thing I want to say on linguistic data, because I think that's a very good example, and please apologies for the disembodied voice experience right now.
Right.
I think this is a space where very interesting experiments are now done that try to shift the debate from this is data we found in the wild, so we used it to train the model, to conversations. What can we do to make this linguistic data work as a commons? And I think the first step was taken by the so-called Big Science Project, which came at a very good moment in 2022, and is for me a very good example of basically data commons, with a lot of participatory work, with a lot of collaboration of rules of using data. This was a project basically spearheaded by Hugging Face with several research institutions, very big collaborative project that's in Big Science, which led to the creation of a generative AI model called Bloom at the same time that was released at the same time as ChatGPT. A bit unfortunately, there hasn't been follow-up. I would really like to see continuation of this project because I think it really set the right direction. But it basically started asking the question how to work with language data. Today, similarly, very interesting work done by Common Voice, which was highlighted, Stefan, in your presentation. I also look at them at asking these questions. Okay, we want content to be shared, but we also want collective rights in something as important as the shared language, especially rare languages, minority languages, to be protected. They are working basically with all kinds of license experiments right now, which are in early stage, but will hopefully lead us to some new ideas about what it means to be the commons. And maybe I'll stop here and try to fix my camera while you Q&A. Apologies for this.
No worries. No worries. And thanks for that, Alek. It was super, super interesting. And so, yeah, I'm sensitive to the time. I want to make sure that, and again, this was kind of ambitious to have 4 very interesting people join a call that only lasts an hour. But I want, Alek, are you still? Yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
all right. Okay. So I want to see, I don't know, Vivienne, whether you want to respond to one of the questions. Thanks for responding kind of online as well, but I also want to make sure that people can hear your reactions, especially also the reactions to kind of Susan, which really kind of challenges the issue of, on the one hand, participation, on the other hand, kind of the public good model. And so, and again, I don't know, Angie and Heather, again, I mean, you also, and again, totally aligned with some of the work we do on co-creation, participatory ways of going about it. But at the same time, there are challenges attached to that. And I don't know, Vivienne, whether you want to quickly respond to Susan's
Sure.
comment here, and
I was
then Heather,
actually
then,
in
yeah,
the process of responding to
yeah,
Susan here to say, I mean, in my experience, a large swath of for-profits think their work is inherently a public good. Let me say, I do not agree with them, but it's very much a Silicon Valley philosophy that what I do is for the good, and the very language of economics, where they use terms like welfare. You know, if someone clicked on an ad, that's treated as a welfare raising because economic theory said they wouldn't click on it if it wasn't their interest. I don't buy into a lot of that. So one of the things we do, as I mentioned before, everything has to be approved by our board. So not just for-profit, nonprofit, scientific, a relationship has to go through the board. The next is everything's opt-in. So the data is associated with an individual. If they haven't given explicit permission, then you can't access their data. And I realize this creates some additional hoops. There are considerations for scientific validity in having these sorts somewhat uneven data sets. But I just can't get around the idea that there does need to be some guardrails on this. And we can't really speak to, you know, if our sole fiduciary responsibility is to these participants, the individuals involved, then we need to give them some choice as to whether they participate, not just a holistic choice, but at a granular level with their data. Maybe you share some of it, but not all of it. We're trying to build systems that allow for this kind of very nuanced. And then lastly, some of our experiments with federated data sets, federated systems to allow data that isn't even part of our system, but maybe we can access it in its home storage without violating privacy. So there's a whole bunch of considerations here. But let's be clear, I'm not assuming nonprofit or for-profits are building systems in the public good, but I do believe that if you can take the data ownership off the table and part of their discovery creates new data within the trust, then whatever they're building, as long as we've agreed it passes our initial sniff test and it's not to public harm, then it creates its own value proposition. And I don't want to leave that off the table because so many organizations, particularly in the biomedical space, are for-profits. And we wouldn't want to just take all of that data and throw it away simply because we may not see human good as defined in the for-profit motive of that company. So it's tension. It's a genuine tension, but one where we're trying to find the right boundaries.
Can I just add to that really quickly?
please, Heather, yeah.
So, I think there's a friction between both the values in different spaces. So the value of a for-profit company and the value of community and the value of academic research, those are all different. And we have to recognize that and have a process for reconciling and developing shared values, right? And shared goals. So, and I think that generally that's possible where you can find commonalities. But I think the other friction that we see a lot in community engaged research is the pace. Community or commercial entities are rushing to be the first to release. They want a product, they want to capture a market. That's the time frame on which they operate. We know that community engaged community-based research or projects take a lot longer. And so I think we're in such an early phase of whatever generative AI phase we're in such early days. We're not seeing the domain-specific contributions. We're not seeing the long-term investments yet. And I think we just have to remind people that this is where we are in this arc, and it's going to take time.
No, that's great, Heather, and I agree with you is that it's still very early days to really, but that's also why I think there's also really need for experimentation of new models on how you go about that. And I think all of you have basically contributed to that. And I think that's really where we need to start building some kind of comparison, which goes back to, I think, Angie, what you also referred to, which was, anyway, how do we make sure what is fit for purpose, right? Which is the other kind of key concern I have is that, anyway, quite often it's kind of everything is now, anyway, this or everything is now that. But then the question, and this is my last question for all of you, is then how do you go about defining the purpose in a commons manner? Because we focus a lot on data comments, right? But what about question comments, right? So how do we know what are the questions that commonly, if we can use that term, actually are the ones that should be prioritized? Which also, again, Alek, you did great work on public AI, but anyway, towards what end, right? And are there certain kind of priorities that we should go about this? And we have 2 minutes, so you have like a very easy question that everyone can quickly reflect to. And perhaps, Vivienne, if you could quickly
Sure. I
react,
mean, we
very
were
short.
question
Yes.
first for us. So our board's question is very simple. Does this project advance human development? I don't mean that finding the answer to that question, but the question itself
Yeah,
is very
needs to be
straightforward.
answered that question.
And any project that we feel genuinely advances human development, even if that isn't the explicit intention of the project, it's a side effect. Okay, let me add this. One of the reasons I became an entrepreneur is because it moves fast, because I got tired of 18-month funding cycles. And so there's something actually interesting about creating an entity that might be able to draw off the speed of entrepreneurship, new data constantly getting refreshed and coming into the system, at the same time that some actual domain expertise, some actual problem focus is happening at longer timescales, and we might be able to bridge some of that gap. Again, it's aspirational, but that's where we're at.
Great. Angie?
You know, I second that. But I also would like to remind people that some of the questions aren't new, they're just repackaged. And prioritizing projects, cash, efforts, those are not new questions. They're just new for us because of the sheer volume and ubiquitous amount of data that we seem to have, even though, you know, a good amount of it is crappy data that we probably shouldn't be using and pretending like it's decent data. You know, so I agree with what Vivienne says. Alek's going to say something quasi similar, I think, where, you know, what the fundamental function is what Heather was talking about. What is the question that you're trying to solve, and then solve it. And that also leads us down the path of, are we talking about public data for a public good, public AI, private AI, right? And I think lumping everything together in the old categories and not allowing the granularity that's now emerging when we talk about data, information, and knowledge is going to leave us in a very bad place if we don't start being more granular in the way that we ask those questions. Am I supposed to tag to Heather?
Thank Heather and then Alek.
Yeah, so I just want to emphasize Angie's point that we have to be more specific. We cannot continue to lump all of these tools and data together. And also, I think that question space comes out of relationship, and there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution.
Great. And Alek, you have the last word. No pressure. While you're still not frozen.
And simply because I think we need experiments, but relatively simple ones. I like alignment assemblies. They are a simple tested model for participation. I would like to see more of them, basically. And then, of course, I would like to see other forms, but this is for me a good starting point. There have been several. I would like to see tons of them. We'd really learn from them. And I think they're a kind of scalable, nice solution.
interesting, and it relates also with kind of Vivienne's notion of how do you decide what is aligned with human development, for instance, would be interesting to see. So in kind of a thing. Wonderful. Well, I'm so frustrated that we didn't have more time, but that's the nature of those rapid kind of exchanges. And if we would have more time, we would probably have less participants because everyone is running out of time. So thanks, Vivienne, thanks, Angie, thanks, Heather, thanks, Alek, for joining us to start a conversation about data commons, because I think what is the key message here is that there are still a lot of issues that need to be unpacked, and especially that it depends on the concrete aspects, not just the generic, and that we really need to do kind of more work on how do we advance this in a way that serves the public interest as well. So thanks everyone. Thanks the participants for joining. Sorry that I didn't manage to address all the questions, but we will gather them and share them back with the participants in case they want to provide some answers as well. Thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the week. Take care. Bye-bye.